My name is Tom Clark, and I oversee storage software at IBM, including data protection. And what I want to do today is just give you a little bit of a survey of some trends in the industry, which I think we're all very well aware of, perhaps painfully aware of, and some of the things and the challenges that does for us in the data protection space. Protecting data is still critically important. What does it mean with some of the changes that are happening? What are some of the things that are being done recently around data protection? And where does the industry really need to go in this space in order to meet those needs? So let me just briefly touch on a few of the challenges here. And what I'm going to do is, as I said, this is kind of a survey thing. I'm going to step through, as I just mentioned, some of the challenges, some of the things that we're trying to do to meet those challenges, and I intend to leave a few minutes at the end so we can have a little discussion and a Q&A at the end here. So first of all, data growth. Everyone knows about data growth, especially in the unstructured data. So we see an explosion of unstructured data. You know, we're just really at the front end of the curve on this, really. It's going to continue to get more and more. The Internet of Things is causing an explosion of data. Social and other kind of interaction type things are causing explosions of data. So a lot of unstructured data explosion. Now, in the data protection space, we've mostly been focused over here, right? We've been focused on the enterprise data, which is, of course, mission critical and all of those kind of things, but it's not growing as fast. It is growing some, and it's causing some pains. I'll come to that here in a few minutes. But this explosion in these other types of data and the kind of workloads that apply to that create a very different set of environments and challenges for us when we start thinking about how am I going to protect this data for my enterprise. Now, a couple other things that are happening. We see storage evolving to more of a software-based model. That's happening in general in the industry. You see that if you look at the results of the big vendors in storage controllers, including IBM. It's shifting, right? The storage controllers are moving towards all flash. SANs are not going to go away. Nothing ever goes away in IT, does it? It just sort of, stays. Tape's been going away for about 50 years now, but it's not. But storage is changing. It's becoming software-based. It's becoming more storage-rich servers with embedded disk. The environments look a lot different. We see object stores starting to become more prominent. A different way to do scale-out storage to store data over time. We see most of our customers going to the cloud. So, this idea of hybrid is basically I've got a certain amount of processing on premises and I've got some in the cloud. So the ideas that we've had in the past about how to deal with enterprises, how to deal with data, that becomes very different when we start talking about data now is not even all under my control. It's off in a cloud and in other places. So we see the landscape in storage changing quite a bit in addition to the data growth that I mentioned. Now, the other thing that's happening is that the workloads are changing. So we still have the traditional workloads, and I'll say a little bit more about those as I go, but we have a lot of new workloads, very scale out, very highly parallel, and this is a whole different world for us. Using the embedded storage often. So we have a whole different kind of set of workloads, and that's a whole different set of challenges, and I'll mention in a minute the kind of challenges that this presents. But the NoSQL databases, the Hadoop workloads, Spark, these kind of things in analytics. So we have new generation of applications. Now, the combination of things creates some challenges for us in the data protection space. And before I talk about those challenges, let me just kind of step back and remind us why we started down this path all those years ago. And the typical data protection solution historically has been, I've got a set of data sources, applications, and so forth. I have some method to interact with those, and I move all the bits somewhere else. right? I've got a data protection server. I do all kinds of optimizations to try to make it efficient and as cost effective as I can. But this is basically my process. I interact with my environment. I move all the bits somewhere else, and I keep track of them for perhaps forever or long periods of time, depending on how paranoid I am about aging anything out of the world, right? So this is the world that we've been in for a very long time. My friend David here from IBM helped invent this world, 25, 30 years ago in IBM research. So, we've been doing this a long time, and it creates some challenges for us. Now, some people, as we evolve to some of these new models and cloud and these kind of things, I get questions sometimes. Do I still need to care about backup and data protection? Is that something I still have to worry about? Well, we'll come to that in some of these specific use cases here in a few minutes, but I still have the same kinds of problems that you see in the middle of the chart there in blue or purple or whatever that showed up as. I still can have hardware failures. They don't happen quite as often as perhaps I had way back in the early days, but I still have hardware failures, especially with embedded disk kind of technologies. I still have application and operator errors that walk on data and corrupt it and cause problems or drop things and delete and so forth in my operations. Malware has been in the news like crazy here lately. The ransomware and some of those kind of things. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So I still have reasons to do the data protection kinds of concepts, but there's some challenges that come with this way of doing things. And let me just step through what some of those challenges are here briefly. So even in the operational space and some of my transactional kind of areas, the data there is not growing at the exponential kind of rates, but it's still getting too big. I hear from customers all the time, my backup window, first of all, is gone because I'm a global operation. It's 24/7 now. There's stuff happening all over the world. I'm centralizing my data centers. I've got these core systems that everything's in. I bought 12 companies. They're all now merged in. All of that is becoming more and more centralized. I don't have time to back it up. And God forbid if I have to do a restore, I can't be down for as long as it takes you to move all those bits back and get me set up again. So, I can't be down for several hours when I can't take orders, I can't ship product, whatever it might be in some of these critical systems. So, even for transactional systems, we're seeing this as an issue. Now, Scaleout Applications, I mentioned the new workloads and the Scaleout Applications. And I do have customers who are doing things like backing up Hadoop to a traditional backup system, but it really doesn't line up very well for this. Sure, I can scale out the backup system and do some parallel things here, but the level of parallelism between the left and right side of this chart is very mismatched, right? I may have hundreds of systems over here. They've all got sets of disk. Trying to funnel that all down into some set of backup servers and make sense of it, it just doesn't make sense. The amount of data is difficult to deal with. It just doesn't match very well. So Scaleout Applications, and I am seeing, at first when we got into things like Hadoop and the analytics and some of these different workloads, people didn't care much about backup or data protection at that point. I load a bunch of stuff in, I run my Hadoop workload, I get some answers out, I go do something with those answers, and I'm done. What I'm seeing is that's changing, that not only do I want to keep track of what it is that I went through all that crunching to figure out, I want to leverage that for my next set of work, and so on. So this is becoming much more central, the idea of analytics, learning about the information, all of those kinds of things. And of course, there are a lot of us in the industry talking about AI and cognitive kinds of things. I can't afford for this stuff to go away now. It used to be, well, I don't care, I'll just recreate it. Well, these things get big enough, or I start to end up with petabytes of data. I'm not going to recreate that stuff very easily, so what am I going to do? copying it over into here is also not very workable. So we need a different answer for these kind of workloads. Now, I mentioned the cloud, and most in industry moving to a cloud model. I talk to a lot of storage people, and typically the way I come across this is somebody in the storage area, storage management, implementation, optimization, whatever, says to me, well, somebody up the food chain said we're moving stuff to cloud, now what do I do, right? Because typically it's an executive type decision that says cloud is good, and so let's go do cloud. Well, so what you see here is there's a couple different angles on this. One is what we like to call a lift and shift of workloads to the cloud. So I've got some in my data center. Let me just push those out to the cloud. I'll run those out in the cloud, whatever cloud that happens to be. And there's a number of vendors that are popular there. Of course, Amazon and Microsoft, probably the two leading in terms of the most workloads. But I also have workloads that I can spin up in the cloud. I have various services out here. I can get databases, I can get NoSQL databases, relational databases, I can get analytics clusters, I can get anything I want just about out here. Everything from just the infrastructure to put my stuff on, all the way up to SaaS applications that will just do it all for me. So cloud is a whole different beast out here. And I'm used to dealing over here. Now I've got to figure out what to do when these workloads are now in the cloud. And as we'll see, some of the solutions are workable out here, and some we got to approach this a little bit differently. Now, another thing that's becoming more common is the need to leverage the data in the data protection system. So, I have customers who have hundreds of petabytes of data that they've stored up in their secondary data, their data protection systems. They want to start figuring out, what can I do with that, right? I've collected the enterprise's data. I'd like to do something like run some analytics on it, or not so much at the same level of size, but I want to do my DevOps. I need frequent test refreshes. So one of the challenges is, traditionally it was not terribly easy to do that without simply restoring all the data out of the data protection system. So we need to get more access to the data that sits behind or in our secondary copies of data, so that we can leverage those for business value. They're not just collections that we keep around for some indefinite period of time, or for regulatory reasons or archive reasons or whatever. I want to be able to leverage that. That's kind of tough with traditional solutions. Regulations is another challenge. Regulations like the GDPR regulations in the EU, which will take effect, I think it's in May of next year. One aspect of that is to be able to be forgotten or erased, I think as they're calling it now. That creates a challenge for us, because as you see the graphic over here, and this is just one example, there's many others you could look at in terms of how many copies of data I have, but you can see in this particular survey, 82% of the people surveyed had 10 copies of each database. So when it comes to thinking about how do I deal with this proliferation of data, I've got a regulation I need to comply with because the penalties are very severe on this. I've got a situation where I really need to be able to find and get rid of data that I'm not supposed to keep anymore. How do I go about doing it, right? I've got copies all over the place. I don't even know what copies I've got. I don't know who made them. But somehow I've got to comply with these things. Well, this is an issue for us in the data protection space. Of course, I know what copies I have maybe in my backup server, but there's a lot more running around out there for various purposes, or in analytic systems, or all over the place. So the provenance of data and understanding where the data is, we used to talk about provenance in the sense of certain critical data that I want to make sure, I want to know where it's been and whether it got modified and those kind of things. Now we have provenance problems from the perspective that I really have to know what I've got and where it is, because there are regulations that are going to impose on me, and I better figure out what I've got and be able to do something intelligent with it. Okay. The final challenge I want to mention is ransomware. Now, I shouldn't have put the word avoiding on this chart because I'm not really going to talk about avoiding ransomware. That's a whole nother subject for the security guys. How do I recover from ransomware? You know, the WannaCry virus, I think, was the last one that was prominent, if I remember right. I know I had a customer that had about 20,000 systems that had to be restored because they got hit by the virus. That was a bit of a tense time, I think, for them. So when we talk about ransomware, of course, the first thing I have to think about is I better make sure I have secondary copies of my data, because once I get hit, I either need to figure out how to use bitcoins or I need a secondary copy to go back to, right? So just being able to, again, have an end-to-end view that helps me understand the copies I have or perhaps don't have is important. But also, we talk about things called air gaps. You know, an air gap is really just it's data stored in a way that it's not easy to get accessed by malware or ransomware, okay? Now, there's been a lot of proposals, you know, if you look in the industry and different vendors, and we talk about it, others talk about it, there's a lot of different ways to think about trying to create air gaps. Some do it talking about it with replication. So what I'm going to do with replication, either my primary system or my backup system, my secondary system, is I'm going to replicate the data, but I'm not going to keep connectivity here. I'll just sort of connect, throw the next set of data over, and disconnect. And so, you know, depending on timing and when the virus, maybe it got into my system, maybe I'm protected there, and maybe I've got a gap there. Another one is object storage. Okay, object is a little bit different than your typical mounted file system. You can't see it when you're on the host over here. It's over a REST API unless you've got the credentials and the information to know what the URLs are to go look at the object storage. You can't really get to it. So there's a bit of an error gap there. I've had several conversations with industry analysts around that, and we kind of go back and forth on, is that truly an error gap, or is that good enough? The most prominent air gap is tape, because that's one that I clearly, literally have an air gap where I can take the tape and I can go put it on a shelf and I've got a copy that's squirreled away, which is great. On the other hand, tape is a little more to deal with in terms of the management side of it, and a lot of folks are trying to move away from this for what I would call sort of data protection type workloads. It's not so easy to take advantage of my data if I've got to read it all from tape versus something that's spinning. So, you know, I've got a bit of a conundrum here, because this is my best air gap for the ransomware type viruses, but it may not be what I want to put my secondary data on. So ransomware is certainly a challenge, and so whatever we decide to do when it comes to protecting our data, we have to keep these kind of things in mind. I've got to think about, okay, what happens if I get an attack? Can I recover from it? Do I have copies in the right places to be able to recover if I get attacked by ransomware and I have systems that begin to get infected and it starts to go through my company? Now, of course, ransomware as well, one of the downsides with it is it can lie around for quite a while too. So that's maybe a longer discussion on the ransomware front, but I have to think about what kind of gaps do I have so that if I've got to go get a copy, I can have it squirreled away. Okay. Let's talk about some of the things that we see customers doing in data protection, and I'm kind of embarrassed to put this chart up here, but we've been doing storage snapshots for how long? I don't know, 20 some years. I remember in my previous life, in my Informix days, I think I was working on the APIs to do this stuff in the mid-90s or something like that, way back when. But this is one of the things I talk to customers, and they will tell me, you know, I don't have the backup window. The challenge I mentioned is, you know, I can't wait for all the bits to come back. And my first question is, are you using snapshots to save it and revert to the snapshot, very fast restore? We got all the hooks into your, you know, your enterprise apps. You know, it's all there. It works. No, I'm not doing that. So it's, you know, maybe when we get to the Q&A, somebody can enlighten me on why that might be, but we don't see as much usage of this as you would expect. I don't know if it's a complexity thing, if it's just being able to deal with all the end-to-end of it. Maybe we've just always moved the bits around and that's just what people do until it doesn't work anymore. But snapshots is certainly something we see more and more uptake on. And, you know, if you look at some of the Gartner surveys and so forth, they would tell you the same, that this is going to become more and more prominent. Again, even though we've had this around for eons, it's not used as widely as you would expect. Self-protecting storage. So the idea here is I have some way to tell the storage to take either a snapshot or a differential backup consistent with my application, and the storage takes care of that. It takes care of taking that differential. It takes care of moving it out to somewhere. You know, it could be a VTL with that dedupes and does other things. Could be direct to tape or to object, but it's all managed within the storage system. Now, Gartner, if you look at their latest survey and Magic Quadrant around data protection, they're expecting that within 5 years, 20% of storage systems will protect themselves this way. So you won't have some kind of external type thing that's, you know, your backup system. The storage system basically is handling it for you. It knows what apps are running. It knows how to take the snapshots or get the differential commands from the app, and it manages this process for you. Now, again, there's an orchestration aspect to this and a reporting aspect that's an interesting challenge. If I've got a bunch of storage controllers out there that are sort of doing their own data protection thing, you know, how do I sort of understand what's going on and what's protected and not? You know, I'm not looking at a central place anymore to see that. And if I end up with large differentials and backups, that's a challenge, right? There's the horsepower in this box is really intended for serving the hosts. If I'm doing significant movement sideways, you know, that's extra load on the system that has to be accounted for. Some have suggested, well, I'll have some external data movers and things, and so there may be some other ways to do it, but self-protecting storage is an option that we're starting to see in the market. Now, let me talk about Scaleout Applications, because in the Scaleout world, it's started to kind of change the way people are thinking about data protection. Okay, so my Scaleout Applications, now I could run on a common storage Scaleout storage layer. You know, IBM's got one, so do the other major vendors, and I could just sort of manage it at the storage layer. Now, that works, but in many cases, that's not the kind of storage architecture that these things are running on. They're running on embedded disk kind of architectures. Some of these apps are in the cloud. I'll come to the cloud a little bit further. But, you know, running this clustered scale-out storage layer is not necessarily the preferred approach. We do have customers doing that, but often that's not the case. So what I really need is I need the application to be able to do this itself. I need it to be able to take its own snapshots, and I need to be able to replicate. Now, if you look at the prominent solutions out there, in, you know, whether it's NoSQL databases like Mongo and Cassandra and some of these, you know, Hadoop, replication was something that was there pretty much from the beginning. You know, I'm going to expect that I'm running on some kind of cheap embedded disk. I expect these things are going to break on some regular basis. I'll create copies, right? I'll create some in my cluster. You can tell me how many you want elsewhere and so forth, and I can create copies. We're starting to see more now of the snapshot idea as well, where originally that stuff wasn't really there. They're all starting to do snapshot now, Because as I mentioned earlier, trying to pump all this data into my data protection system is really not terribly workable. Especially at scale. So we start to get into the idea, well, I'm going to build this kind of stuff into my application. If I want to squirrel a copy away, I'll have a way to copy it off, say, to an object store somewhere. But I will take snapshots to have points to go back to. I will replicate. I understand the world I'm in and the scale-out nature of it, and I'll build it into my application. Now, one of the interesting things is I'm starting to see some of our customers look to do that in their own application development. In fact, I talked to a very large enterprise in a very regulated industry who said, well, going forward, I'm going to get rid of all those backup systems, and I'm going to do an object store, and I'm going to tell all my app developers, there's the object store, this is how you do backups. You write your stuff into there, you figure out how to do all this stuff, and you put it in there. Now, the challenge with that, of course, is the expertise by the app developer, right? The guys doing Mongo can know how to do this. The guy that's writing the next web app for you may not really understand what it means to protect data, right? And in fact, that's what I told this gentleman, and he didn't believe me. But at any rate, we'll see who's right next time I visit him. But that expertise, it's not quite there, right? It's a nice idea to say, okay, app guys, I've got facilities like an object store that's immutable. Go knock yourself out. Put your stuff in there at whatever interval and everything. I mean, this is a way beyond the idea of, okay, here's a handful of SLAs from my data protection solution. What do you need, right? We've been there for a long time, and certain apps, of course, have been able to back themselves up or drive the data protection for a long time, but that expertise is an issue. But this trend is starting to, for lack of a better word, maybe democratize the idea of data protection, where you see more at the application side. I see more desire. I want to do it myself. I want the self-service. We've had some elements of self-service for a while, but I think we're going to see much more of that going forward. And as you follow the prominent apps, you're going to see these kind of capabilities in there. And I think this is really the way we're going to see it go, is they're going to protect themselves. Now, of course, the challenge here as you look at this, if you think back a couple charts to things like air gaps and those kinds of issues, okay, maybe the air gap issue is not quite as big here. A lot of that attack is on Windows systems. Maybe these are all running Linux or something like that, so it's a little different world. But still, it's, how do I get an air gap? Well, maybe that's my copy to object that I need to do periodically, so at least I have something I can go back to. But those are the kind of things we have to think through to make sure this is an end-to-end kind of a solution. Now, speaking about clouds, I mentioned earlier the lift and shift kind of idea. And really what we see there is a more traditional backup just running in the cloud, right? I need the ability to have object storage on the back end, but if I'm using a data protection solution, what I really want is just to be able to have it protected the same way. We're seeing this, most clouds are running some form of VMware infrastructure now in order to move apps easily to the cloud. We're going to see traditional kind of backup happen there. That's fine for those workloads, but what about the other stuff that's running out there? We really need, as I mentioned on the previous chart, we really need snapshot kind of functions. We need application-driven data protection kind of solutions out there, because often, from the perspective of somebody who's doing data protection kind of software, often a lot of details are hidden behind the curtain here, right? The ability to poke at what's underneath or to get at bits and pieces, you don't have that opportunity. All you see is whatever the infrastructure is showing you or the SaaS app, and you may have some APIs available to you, but you can't get at the underlying infrastructure in the same way. So we have to be able to deal with things like snapshots and so forth. These things are not quite there in the cloud. It's coming though. We're starting to see more of this, I think. And I think as enterprises are doing the hybrid thing, that started originally, I'll spin up some analytics because it's easy to get something up and running. It's kind of gone to, my CIO says we need to move 25% of our apps to the cloud over the next year. That's where I start to get some of this shift. And as that happens, we see more and more of this idea that, I need to figure out data protection, maybe even want to replicate what I have out here back to my data center, so I'm holding a copy of all my data. I don't want data out in somebody else's cloud if it's public and not have a copy of it myself. So I need to be able to get it back into my data center. So this is a challenge for us because so many of these aspects, for the IT shop or for those of us who are trying to help the IT folks do things like data protection, there are things out of our control and we need APIs and we need ways to make this stuff work to provide the kind of reliability that customers are used to. Now, let me mention just data reuse. And I just got a few more minutes here and then we'll have a little discussion. We'll have a few minutes left. Data reuse. So one of the things that was, I guess, maybe a benefit out of the transition to hypervisors and VMware and these kind of things is we started to see a lot of direct mount of data out of secondary data systems, out of backup systems. Whereas before, being able to direct mount out of there was almost unheard of. There were some systems that could do it, but not very much. We've started to see that happen more often, where I can start to mount things out. We see that for test kind of operations. There's a number of vendors, some startups and new guys that are doing these kinds of things where their niche is basically to collect data and then mount it out to other places, right? They may not support all apps, but I think the industry is moving in this direction. And granted, when I talk about a direct mount, there's a bunch of different ways to do that, right? I can store data in a native format, so it's easy to, put some kind of API in the front. I can put some kind of a shim in there that, makes it look like it's a direct mount, even if it's, deduped or other kinds of things behind the scenes. There's different ways to go about doing this, but I think we're going to continue to see more of the idea of a direct mount out of our secondary data for analytics, for other kinds of use cases. And this, by the way, is beyond just the idea of, say, some basic indexing, right? We have those kind of things today in data protection systems. This is beyond that. Maybe an index is useful to help me cull down to a set of data that I want, but I really want to put it in my analytics system and do something interesting with that data set that I just discovered through a search. So, and having to do full restores and things like that is that's becoming, less accepted, let's say, and the ability to really reuse the data, we're going to see more and more of that as we go forward. Okay, now let me just wrap this up a little bit. So, what is it that we need? One of the things that we talked about here and some of the challenges and so forth and some of the trends in the industry, we really have to be doing this with software. We're trying to run in the clouds. We're trying to support these hybrid kinds of environments and the flexibility. More and more of this function is going to be in software. I mean, it was already software based, but often in appliances and things. We're going to see it more in the software so that I can do this anywhere. And as you can see, as I've kind of laid it out here, there's all different data sources, right? Everything from my traditional applications and transactional relational database stuff all the way out to the stuff I'm renting in the cloud. And there's a lot of different ways to take copies of this stuff, right? We just step through some, and they're optimized depending on workload, depending on the business need and what I'm trying to do with the copies. So I've got all kinds of sources. I've got certain functions I want to use. I got to be able to move it if I need to copy it. I need to be able to mount the data. I need to reuse it. There's lots of different APIs and things to integrate with. So you know, this data protection has always been fairly complex in many ways, and it's not getting less because I've got all these different ways now to go about doing it. So simplicity is really something I need. I need a way that I can survey what kind of protection I need, what kind of secondary data I need, and have a simple way to deal with it. And then I need orchestration. Because a lot of what we're talking about here, you know, these facilities are built into a lot of these systems. We talked about self-protecting storage and these other kind of things. I need to be able to orchestrate this so that, you know, whatever kind of operation you want, if it's a snapshot, if it needs to move from here to there, I can orchestrate that and I can track it, right? I really need a central record and an ability to report on this stuff. You know, because eventually the CIO is going to show up on my door and say, am I protected, right? Are we keeping track of these copies? What happens if ransomware hits us? Are we ready? I don't know. If it's all decentralized and all these guys are doing their own things, well, you know, they have facilities built in, but I need a way that I can orchestrate and track it in a more central way so that I do know, first of all, what copies do I have and where are they, so that if I need to drop things or I need to find things, I know where it is, but I also need the ability to do the reporting on it and know that, yes, I am protected, yes, we do have the copies, we have the air gaps, all those kinds of things. Self-service, I talked a little bit about the need for much more self-service here so that it's not just the data protection guy that's running everything and just setting it all up and doing it. Yes, maybe I'm controlling the orchestration of it and I understand what's happening in the reporting, but I let others request what they need and request the orchestration, request the restores and the copies and all those things, so I don't have to be in the middle of it on all those operations, everything that they want to do. And then, of course, the data functions have to be there to be able to provide these kind of facilities, to move the data and so forth. So that's what I had for you today. Hopefully that was somewhat informative and gives you kind of a survey of some of the things that are going on out there, some of the challenges and some of the things we're doing to try to meet those challenges. We do have a few minutes left. I can take a few questions or comments or feedback, anything somebody wants to bring up on the topic. Who has a question? Yes?
Usually getting the data back, if you have like asynchronous packet replication like what we're running, it's a matter of half an hour and not a lot of challenge. And you can do that out of risk region. But getting the environment back, meaning getting the platforms, that can be, even though you get the data back in half an hour, that's a 2 to 3 day event.
Yeah.
So we've been experimenting with, well, VMware has site recovery.
Site recovery manager.
And now that we have GDR announced for power, where we can recover virtual machines on different infrastructure. Actually, we don't need the same infrastructure. We can recover the virtual machine. What do you think about virtual machine recovery outside the data? You're just recovering everything: network settings, user policies, platforms, OSs, middleware, data, all comes back to one.
Yeah, I kind of oversimplified a bit in talking about some of the snapshot and things. I mean, replication and HA kind of goes with that, right? Because a lot of the customers that I'm working with, they're trying to cover both ends of it, right? They're trying to have basically a warm standby kind of environment. And then it's a question of, okay, what do I do to make that warm, right? Warm means, as you mentioned, I've got the apps and things there so that I'm not starting from scratch trying to boot all that up and get all the apps running, but a fresh copy of the data. Now, replication and doing the HA type replication is very doable there. Certainly storage systems are extremely efficient at doing that. Even replicating the snapshots so that if I lose that and I need to revert, I can get the snapshot over here and, all those kind of change kind of things. One of the things I didn't talk about, we are starting in the VMware space to see more of what used to be called continuous data protection, right? Which was sort of all a buzz for a while, but didn't really get used a lot in practice because it was sort of intrusive and it didn't work very well in most cases. So
It crashes on volume.
yeah, so we are starting to see a little more of that, especially in the VMware space, where I'm trying to sort of keep the other side very much in sync and warm and so forth. So I think that HA angle, which I really didn't get onto here, is certainly a near cousin here that has to be included as well, because it does create the same kind of issues, right? It's not just that primary system. There are other things that can fail, and getting the apps up and all that can take a very long time too.
Well, replication solves the DR problem, because you can make transaction currency like 4 to 5 seconds without much stress, but it doesn't solve the data protection problem.
Right.
Because we had an example last year where somebody deleted 28 core volumes.
Yes.
And 4 seconds later, they were
that was happily replicated to the other side. Yeah.
But now that we have global relationship snapshots, and we can manage the snap copies of not the journal volume, but the set-aside volume that gets snapped every 4 to 5 seconds after the last packet update is applied. We can take snapshots, and we can manage a snapshot with something like SelfProtect or one of the other.
Yeah, and you start to get, some of these kind of things, especially when they're frequent, it starts to approximate some of the things we were trying to do years ago with CDP type solution. So,
but we're really excited about GDR. That announced about 6 weeks ago from IBM, and that's what lets you recover an entire virtual machine in the power space.
Right.
In the Unix and Linux space.
Yeah. Other questions, other comments, or points of discussion over here?
Thank you for the talk. Appreciate that. One question I have is your talk more or less centralized on DR and business continuity.
Yeah.
Have you done much work in terms of data protection, in terms of things what's happening with Equifax, people somehow got it?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, what about more the protection from a security kind of perspective? We've all seen in the news the Equifax hack, and hopefully you've gone out there to see if you were affected or not, although I went out there and it didn't really tell me anything, which I think was another problem. But, so we're focused on those kind of issues at the storage level to the degree that we can help, right? And I think, one of the things, even things like having more ubiquitous encryption, some aspects of that, and using encryption in broader ways, those are things that we're looking at from the storage kind of perspective, more encryption in flight, not just at rest, because, the people that hacked Equifax didn't run in and steal the disk drives. They went through the front end and sucked the data out, right? Where if it was encrypted on disk, it wasn't once it got to memory. So there's some things like that. Personally, I don't deal with those things so much. We have a whole security division in IBM that's focused very much on those kinds of things. I deal with the cleanup once it happened, but I think that is a very interesting challenge, and it will sort of work its way back to some of these things here, because I think front-end systems are going to have to continue to change to try to combat those threats, and we have to tie into that and deal with those kind of things with encrypted data and other kinds of stuff. Okay. Other questions? Anything else? Okay, I'll be around for a few minutes out in the hallway if anyone wants to chat a little bit further, but thanks for coming out today. I appreciate it. I hope the talk was helpful for you. Thanks.